But yeah, hello everybody. Good morning here in Bergen, Norway. Good evening in Australia, which is where both of our guests are located today. And thank you both so much for spending your night with us from the other side of the planet. That's fantastic. Welcome to another event of Laser Bergen. This is our ongoing series. We bring together talks, lectures, creative works that engage particularly with more than human and post-human narratives, digital creative practices, techno arts and AI, and a range of other themes that are exciting, they're provocative, maybe sometimes a little troubling, but always hopefully compelling and thought-provoking. Laser Bergen is part of the Leonardo Laser Network, which is founded by Leonardo, the International Society for the Arts, Sciences and Technology. They're our partner institution for Laser Bergen, and Laser Bergen is hosted at the Center of Digital Narrative, which is a Norwegian Center of Research Excellence at the University of Bergen. We explore how narratives and creative practices shaped by computation are transforming culture, and in particular, the Arts Integrated Research Node, which is led by Professor Jason Nelson, who I can see is here today. My name is Alinta Krauth. I will be your host today. We have a very exciting lineup of two speakers, two of genuinely my favorite artists at the moment. They're producing amazing works right now. We have Rewa Wright and we have Audax M. Gawler, and they'll be speaking about human and non-human connections and interactions in their practices. They'll introduce you to their creative works. We'll also perhaps speak more generally about creative futures, I think. So, for example, how AI might be affecting creative practices. So all sorts of future concerns will be covered here by two artists who are very interested in planetary futures and planetary care. Their work intersects with ideas of science, of technology, of collaboration, alternative futures, and of course, therolinguistics, which is the title of this talk, and other ways of perceiving and reading the world. So we'll hear from both of the artists and then we might have question time at the very end. So if you have any questions, please type them into the chat as you think of them, and either I can read your question out at the end, or you're more than welcome to connect your audio during question time and join in the conversation. So to briefly introduce each speaker, first we'll hear from Rewa, a computational artist, real-time animator, and emerging technologies researcher who explores the intersection of bleeding-edge technologies, creative practice, and critical thinking. A key aspect of Rewa's work is fostering interdisciplinary collaboration that bridges art, science, and technology to develop innovative frameworks that showcase the potential of computational creativity. So she's a member of the Digital Arts Committee for the ACM SIGGRAPH and holds similar positions with the IEEE VisArt program and the ICEA International Advisory Board. She's currently senior lecturer in film, screen and animation at the Queensland University of Technology in Australia, and also the co-founder of Uncalculated Studio. So please go ahead and look up all of those things if you've never heard of them before. Then we'll hear from Audax M. Gawler, an award-winning multi-genre symbiopunk, I love that term, whose practice sits at the intersection of speculative design, ecological humanities, and more than human futures world building. They describe their artworks as embodied and participatory prototypes that enact ecological futures attentive to multispecies justice, feral imaginaries, and collaborative survival. Oh my gosh. They are co-founder of the Trans Ecology Club, one half of the Queer Time Lab Geofade, and director of Earthling, a transdisciplinary studio supporting the transition to the Symbiocene. So again, an amazing lineup. Please do search for some of these organizations and take a look for yourself if you haven't heard of them before. These are two really strong voices who are performing innovation across several creative and technological fields. So really excited to have both of them here with us today from the other side of the planet. Without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to our speakers. And we're going to start with Rewa. Whenever you're ready, Rewa, feel free to jump in and please do share your screen with us.
Well, thank you for an amazing introduction, Alinta. I'm sure I haven't done most of those things, but thank you. And look, it's really wonderful to be here. I always love the Laser Leonardo audience, because everyone usually who shows up is some kind of a maker, thinker, organizer, activist, and it's just really refreshing to talk with a like-minded group of people. So thanks so much for coming along, and of course I'm really honoured to be invited by Alinta and Jason to do this presentation today. So I'm going to be whizzing through a bunch of slides. I've actually got myself on a 15-minute timer so that I don't kind of ruin everything. But essentially I've been kind of working with the idea for a while of working kind of between species. So I started off working with AI is this older type of network called a GAN2, Generative Artificial Intelligence, in 2019. And at that stage, it was just kind of a fun thing to do, right? It wasn't the hugely problematic space that it is today. So you can see up in the top right, I've got some of the artwork that I made with AI. It's very, very abstract. But of course now we're dealing with quite a different beast, right? We're dealing with a really highly moderated corporate space, and we're dealing with a space which is really so much about profit, okay, and about getting money out of users for subscriptions. It's also a space where there's tremendous energy use, which is incredibly bad for the planet. That can't be mitigated anytime soon because of the amount of sheer energy that it needs to that machine learning algorithms need to operate, especially in the real-time space. And that's pretty much what everyone's doing right now, is generative AI, whether it's using LLMs or diffusion models for vision. So it's become this highly problematic space in the short distance of time between 2019 and now the start of 2026, right? So what are we to make of this? Well, there are a lot of interesting things, obviously, from a intellectual perspective, but we also need to be really aware that AI at the moment is very unsustainable, and actually it's causing a lot of planetary harm. So we need to always kind of mitigate this when we're working with it. So in terms of my practice, most of it is actually not AI. So it's probably about 20% of it is AI, and 80% I make in a program called Touch Designer, which is sort of a generative procedural generative kind of real-time animation system. Here's just a few kind of shots of things. A work called Cosmic Signals I made for a Fed square screen, and a little work in the bottom left-hand corner called Biorhythms. So the Biorhythms work was a really fun one, because that's actually all of the patterns that you see are actually generated in Touch Designer out of a signal input from a living plant. So that's sort of something that I've been interested in a while, is this idea of kind of expanding your creative agency to the more than human. So it's a really problematic space, because I'm a human and I can't step outside of my form. So everything that I make, and even if I say, oh, I'm going to co-design with plants or with another species, that's still coming out of my intentionality and my agency. So there's tremendous ethical questions which are really don't necessarily have clear answers, but I try to operate in a gentle, sustainable way as much as possible, and to try to not cause harm. But yeah, I come from a more traditional background, I guess, from photography and graphic design as well. I have a sort of a theoretical formulation called the software assemblage. I started working on that around 2018, and it's become kind of more relevant now that we basically have machine learning algorithms assembling most of our reality, so we're dealing day to day with machine learning algorithms. We might not necessarily be aware of it, but they're in our phones and our laptops and all of our computer systems. When you ring up on the phone and you're on hold to a company, a lot of the time it's going to be an AI voice that guides you through. So you'll be speaking with a chatbot, and it can be quite fun to sort of, if you suspect you're speaking with an AI, to ask it, are you an AI? And it will say, yes, I am. And now, of course, the voice cloning has got so good, it can actually be really hard to tell. 11 Labs have a really, really neat voice clone out there, and you can even monetize your own voice and sell and get a small micropayment from 11 Labs as a clone. But but these are all kind of experimental areas, right? So you're probably getting the idea that I like to kind of like experiment with a lot of different processes. I've been a kind of a bit of a technology freak for a while, so whenever I see something new that comes along, I want to do it, right? So this was the first sort of foray I had into co-composition with plants. So I started it properly, I guess, around 2018, 2019, and then I sort of developed using firstly Unity. Then I went into Touch Designer, which is actually very useful. There's a really cool device now, which I don't use because I've got my own sensors, but there's, if anyone's interested, it's by Playtronica. It's a biofeedback device that you can connect to plants, but also to humans. So it's quite fun. You can actually use the same sensor and you can attach it to your pulse or your thumb, and you can have your own biological rhythm sensed. And you can actually put that through Touch Designer just using a basic kind of signal network. And you can use your pulse and your heart rate to actually drive animations. So that's going to be a video, so I won't show that. I'm not going to do videos today, but Jason was kind enough to put my website in the chat. So if you're interested in videos, just click on that. Otherwise, I know videos always glitch out. So I've been looking at this area, the eco-digital, for a while. This is my cat is here, so if you can hear me yowling. Very interested in the data visualization of the non-human. So specifically working with plants. I was a gardener from a really young age, sort of about age 5. I used to kind of grow my own stuff from seed, and my grandma gave me a part of her garden so that I could actually grow my own plants. And so that's why the plant thing, right? And there's lots of other wonderful things you can do with multi-species. There's my cat here. My gosh, she's just meowing. Here you go, relax, kitty. Just relax. But personally for me, it's the plants because I feel very close to it. I grew up in the bush, so I'm a quarter New Zealand Māori. So I grew up in a very completely bush-clad area, and it actually had an old Māori fortified, what's called a pā site, which is like a fortified village. So when tribes went to war, they retreated to these pā sites. So I grew up kind of wandering around these really unique spaces, which were basically just given over to the forest and were full of birds and fish in the stream and all that kind of good like nature stuff. So I suppose that led me into this area where I was interested in coupling natural phenomena with computational arts. So here's just a few kind of couple of screenshots from some videos which I had in Fed Square called Cosmic Signals, where I used NASA data, which was actually sonifications of cosmic phenomena. So quasars, red dwarfs, dying stars, basically. So that kind of drove the soundtrack and the animations. And this is my collaborator and partner, Simon Howden, who's a more traditional musician. So he's actually been on the Billboard 4 or 5 times. He writes kind of like hit tracks, basically. But I make him do my audio as well. Poor guy. So thinking through this idea of data visualization, so all of these patterns that you can see, they've all been created out of plant signals. And so it's a very sort of iterative practice. Sometimes I put them side by side so that you can see how the signals are operating differently side by side. Or sometimes I'll print them out, or sometimes I'll run them as a video. Okay, but I try to kind of experiment and operate differently. So these are just screenshots out of Logic, which is the audio program that Simon uses. Simon actually gave me these. They're not mine. They're from him. But you can see all of these little dots here. Okay, so they're all notes. So they're actually notes that are produced by the plant signal. So they're converted to MIDI. And so plant signals are inaudible. So the sort of device that I've been using, which is an older device that's called a MIDI sprout. We've modified it a few times. I've had it for 6 years now. I've had to replace a few parts and stuff, so it's a bit non-standard. But basically what it does is it senses the bioelectrical signal of the plant and places it onto the MIDI notes. And then from there you place it onto a scale and you can attach a VST. But each one of these little dots is essentially an instance of a plant signal converted to a note or transposed to a note. So as you can see, like plant signals are very arrhythmic. They're not in a melodic scale, obviously, the way that humans understand melody. It's a completely different sense of, timing and I suppose really difficult for people to get their heads around, right? And I've definitely had experiences before where I've been showing these works, or plants have been running live in public spaces, and people have just hated it, right? Because the plants will be doing a signal that creates this kind of really scatty melody, very kind of like aggressive even at times, very kind of like can be very sort of quick rhythmical pulses, which are maybe not so palatable to the human ear. But yeah, so that's the really interesting thing about working with plants, is you have to put aside your human kind of metrical thinking and your sense of melody, and you have to really embrace the arrhythmic and atonal. I have been working with crystals here. I was supposed to add a crystal image up there, which I didn't do. So pyrite, fool's gold. So that's actually a conductive crystal. So you can actually take a capacitive sensor, and so let's say you had the Playtronica sensor. You can actually stick that onto a pyrite crystal and you can get a signal out of it, and you can use that to drive your animations. So this is another kind of piece that I did. You can see it's kind of got a sort of diffusion AI network in the background. So through Touch Designer, there's a stream diffusion plugin that you can utilize so that you can have like real-time generative AI within Touch Designer. And so here I had on the one side the AI network, and on the other side I had the crystal signals, right? So that's the idea, I guess, of being between species. If we entertain the idea that AI is fast becoming like a species, we can sort of start to think through how, as humans, we might be caught between species, right? Because we're part of the animal kingdom. But then we have these new synthetic species arising, right, which are driven by machine learning algorithms or generative AI. And of course, as we move towards artificial general intelligence, which thankfully is not yet here but will be here in a couple of years, these philosophical questions become questions that we need to increasingly think about. So this is just a bit of I've only got a couple of minutes left. That's just a boring rundown of my contribution. You don't want to see that. You want to see more pictures. Here we go. So I also do a lot of curatorial work with emerging technologies, which I love. I love curating emerging technologies. It's always so exciting because you never know what people are going to do, and it's really can be quite challenging to install. Because you don't know what the technology is going to be. Everyone's setup is very bespoke. But it's something I do from time to time. So I've curated a couple of programs for IEEE Viz Arts program. I'm not involved there anymore, but 2 was enough, and that was fun. I did Melbourne and Tampa, Florida. And then I also did a big program called Constellations for ISEA 2024 in Brisbane. So that was a big kind of emerging technology program. I think we had roughly 100 artists. All working with quite experimental types of technology. And I got to take that program to Ars Electronica as well, which was a fun sort of outcome for everybody. This is just, I feel like this is a presentation that I'm using for some kind of work performance framework or something. Sorry, everybody. I should have created more pictures. Oh gosh. Okay, here we go. But yeah, thinking through this, back to this idea of the software assemblage, right? We can sort of see how like the world is kind of increasingly assembled by software, but not only just software generally, but very specific types of agential software, right, that are kind of guiding our human existence right now, and they're causing many sort of philosophical and ethical rethink of not only how we interact with machines, but how we interact with each other. So as artists, it's fun to experiment with this type of technology, but we always need to remember in the background that it is corporate technology at the moment, and there's been like a corporate takeover of this kind of technology in the last few years, right? And you see very, very large companies involved in this space, and they're increasingly guiding not only the direction of their software products, but they're also guiding the direction of our nation state governments. And that's a dangerous thing, right? And what I mean by that is this assertion that you've heard probably a few times, which is about the future of work. Okay, so I've heard it many times in the media that there are going to be mass job losses because of AI, and especially once AGI, artificial general intelligence, kicks in, there are going to be massive job losses. Now, to me, that seems like such a terrible thing, and I don't know why we would even entertain that as a possibility, right? Because I train young people in universities and I want them all to have jobs, right? And a lot of the people here train young people in universities. It's not going to affect the older people so much. All of us here, we're all fairly established in our careers, but people just coming out with their undergraduate degrees, they're coming into a whole new universe. So for me, it's a huge time to actually try to somehow intervene and to try and help, governments and people who make policy to get to a place in their heads where they're not simply rolling over for big business and saying, yes, well, there are going to be millions of jobs lost. Oh, well, we'll just have to get young people into new careers. I feel like this is also a moment where we need to say, no, we don't want that to happen, because we don't want there to be mass job losses. We don't want there to be more poverty, homelessness, as a result of the unemployment that looks like it will be caused by AI in the next few years. So that's just sort of a little ethical framework, I suppose, something to really bear in mind, like as artists, when we're having a lot of fun experimenting with AI and we're doing, our artistic research, it's also really important to bear in mind that often these same tools that we're using are also the tools of big tech and Silicon Valley. So we really need to try and develop our own craft-based models to counteract that. And I don't really have much more time to go into stuff. But yeah, essentially, as AI moves from a tool to a companion, which has already happened, we need to be really, really wary of some of these ethical forces or insidious forces behind it. Great. So that's really me, and just happy to go into question time if anyone has any questions or any sort of provocations that we could discuss.
Thank you so much, Rewa. We might actually, people can think about questions to ask, but maybe we'll move on to Dax first, and then we'll have some questions at the end that might relate to both of you. But
Right.
thank you so much. Oh my gosh, so many different things. I'm thinking of questions as well, and thinking, which of these works am I even going to ask a question about? Thank
Mm,
you. Um,
thank you.
and Dax, hello.
Hey, yes, hi. Oh my God. I'm thinking so many things now. That was wonderful. Thank you for sharing. Okay, I'll bring you into my screen. Let's do this. Okay, we'll just do this. Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here sharing all this with you. I'm going in a slightly different direction rather than sharing a lot of works that have happened before and you can find on the website. I want to speak with you about a couple of projects that I don't tend to speak about too much, although Alinta and Jason will have heard about them. And then a project that is being installed as we speak, called Tree Tongue. So I've titled this little section, the Future is a Forest and Other Misunderstandings. So First, I just wanted to introduce to you where it is that I'm from. So I am a queer and trans person with immigrant and settler heritage living on the unceded and stolen lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nations here in so-called Australia. And this is the forest that raised me on the Murray River. This is the Barmah National Forest, which is a big wetlands. And this was a place that I spent an enormous amount of time as a child and had the benefit of learning directly from a lot of Yorta Yorta elders. This is on Yorta Yorta country. And this was a place that really began to teach me about more than human enchantment and sparked for me what is one of the primary questions underneath my practice, which is how to work with and reach for more than human worlds. My work looks like lots of different things. I work with media and text, installation and performance. Sometimes it's things like interspecies surrogacy clinics. Sometimes it's experimental kinship labs with black soldier flies. Sometimes it's soil spas from off-planet destinations. Sometimes it is multi-species audits of different institutions in our present day, but they're always focused on the future. And I call myself a symbiopunk because all the work that I do across every field is intended to generate the symbiocene. And my intention is to prototype and to practice and invite people into rehearsing the symbiocene. And so because I want to work closely with more than human worlds and ecologies, it's been really important to me to learn in as many different ways as I can, in embodied practice, in academic and artistic inquiry, in spiritual study, and in lots of field work, how best to hear the voices of more than human worlds and how to best learn how others are speaking around us. And so a lot of my work in the background is based on research thinking about articulation. One of the things that really struck me when I first started researching this in an academic space was new materialism and thinking about matter as speaking, looking at matter as text. So asking where narrative is embedded and thinking about communication from the more than human world, not just in a sense of bird song or pheromone in chemical traces or kinetic movement, but also as present as script in the very landscape itself and the way that species move and relate with one another across those spaces. And I've included here a couple of the quotes that always sit in the background of my practice, thinking about the way that the matter of the world itself is speaking, that the world that we walk on, breathe in, drink, work with is actually an architecture of articulation. It is all agents speaking to one another. Everything that we do and everything that we engage with is in a process of communication. And these communications are existing on vast planetary scales outside of the human, but are no less complex and no less significant. And certainly are not being spoken by creatures less complex than us. So one of the things that I've been really focused on is how do I include these voices? How do I bring these stories with me and trouble that space that Rewa so beautifully spoke to, which is the inherent failure that we have as human authors and creators, which is that we are inside of human frameworks. Before we even necessarily look at being inside of colonial and Cartesian frameworks or capitalist frameworks, we are inherently human. We speak from a species standpoint. And so we have a series of assumptions and habits that are invisible in lots of ways. And it's one of the things that is particularly apparent to me as I go through doing work in addressing the ways in which my own heritage is colonized and addressing the ways in which I participate in colonization. And I see these two things as very much inherently linked. It's like the more that you discover, the more that you learn, the more you realize colonization is the very thing that you sit inside of. And I feel the same thing about anthropocentric habits and cultures. The more I learn, the more I see that there are assumptions under assumptions under assumptions. Like Terry Pratchett might say, turtles all the way down. It's human-centered thinking all the way down. So in order to do this, it really requires a stepping outside of what is language. And of course, there is, as I mentioned before, a list of range of different ways that things are speaking in the world around us, embodied and material and relational ways, languages that are smelt, languages that you can taste, languages that you can touch, very different from how we understand a human language. And something that really demands being broken from a page, being broken from linear frameworks, being broken from our expectations about how to speak and communicate, particularly in written text and narrative. And of course, we're at a moment in time where there are so many different conversations going on about how the others speak across all of the different spaces, from the land to the sea, the water. There is a mass realization occurring that there is not just communication going on, but there are structured communications. There are cultural stories being passed. There are identifiable grammar frameworks, and that everything around us is to some degree speaking. And of course, everyone will be familiar with this in different ways. The electrical pulses of plants is such a beautiful thing to join in that, thinking about the electrical pulse and the forms of communication from Rewa's talk just before. Read that short story, I implore you to go and do it. It's really wonderful and really gets to the crux of a lot of the trouble that we have with translation across species lines. But Vinciane Desprez has given us this beautiful definition of therolinguistics after the short story, which is saying that it's committed to the study and translation of works by animals and later plants, but also that we, through Ursula Le Guin's framework, are also invited to think about how everything speaks: rocks, mountains, rivers. Oscar, who is the curator and manager of the Interspecies Library in New York, has taken Le Guin's framework and turned it into a therolinguistic manifesto, which I highly recommend going and finding. And it amplifies the idea that language is not just our domain, that everything speaks and everything writes if you know where to look. And this is just a sample of some of the ways things speak, some of the ways things write. So you will, I'm sure, be familiar at this point with images of the way that insects and pollinators largely see flowers, and that flowers are controlling the components that are visible to insects based on how much pollen they do or don't have available. Above that is like this beautiful staccato, almost Morse code of the fern spores, and a beautiful visualization of birdsong by the artist Cara Williams. In The Author of the Acacia Seeds, Le Guin begins with this proposition, which is a message scrawled on ant seeds, and a dispute about how these things might be translated. And the idea that ant language is inherently fragmented and very hard to translate. And we have to think really intensely about how to, or really intently, how to translate at the moment. It's not enough for us to be able to say things are speaking and that we can register those voices, but we have to lean in and try and find meaning and also identify the vast gaps of knowledge where we don't have meaning. And the reason that's particularly important at the moment is we're having these conversations around rights of nature. And if we're planning on including voices, non-human voices, this here is an image of the Whanganui River that some of you will be familiar with as the river that gained legal personhood in 2017. And the Voice of the River project is a project that brought together all these different species, different groups, in order to be able to hear the voice of the river. So the people who live along the river, the material read and empirical data of the river, the histories and stories of the Maori people who are the traditional custodians of the river and its stewards, all of these things come together to be the voice of the river. And when I first started this project, I began with a thesis in thinking about therolinguistics and how to include non-human voices in human literary frameworks. And these are some of the excerpts from my thesis, which later became a published work, and its material components. And the thing with this is that the story lives in these rocks, and its location is sitting there. The story was designed to be embedded in the location that it's based. These rocks came from that place and then were returned to that place. And there are instructions all the way through the text that require you to work with it. I just want to quickly introduce you to a couple of other works before I come to the new work. This is one of the works that I was working with in 2020 to try and figure out how to translate things outside of the human, how to hear them, how to enact them in the body. And in a residency in 2020 in Finland, there was an unprecedented rain, a huge melt in the middle of winter, and I placed out in the rain stripes of ink across this location, 4 different locations across 3 different days. And they became performance scores. So if you imagine that you're viewing from above, each of these lines is a direct line for a performer to walk and to perform a gesture based on the movement of rain across the landscape at each of these nodes. And here are the group performing the rain. And this is a beautiful troubling of trying to move water narratives inside of the body, knowing that we are so inherently made of water, and also trying to find ways to grapple with the snow melt. This space should be waist deep in snow at the time that we recorded this. I'm going to skip through all of these. This is just another example of a similar thing, but I'm going to skip all the way to tree tongue because I'm determined to stick to time. So thinking about how to translate, first, how to capture non-human script and language, how to identify it, how to sensitively attend to more than human ecologies and bodies, and then identify the pieces that can feasibly be brought back towards a human practice and translated in a way that moves towards something else, something that breaks our language model, something that allows us to speak differently, something that allows us to find entirely new ways of speaking what it is that we live inside of and the times that we live in. And this work is called Tree Tongue, and it was commissioned by Oscar and Interspecies Library, and is a part of an exhibition opening next weekend called the Journal of Therolinguistics at Iscano Gardens in LA. And for this, my partner, Bri Bertucci, and I worked with a plant called Shigubi. So we were invited to come up with the new therolinguistic work to add to the legacy of Ursula Le Guin's short story and the ongoing efforts of interspecies translation. And we had been working very much with tree language, thinking about how trees speak, how forests conceive, and working in that space of how to speak with plants and plant worlds. And so we chose the jagubi as a plant that my partner, who is Brazilian, has worked closely with. The jagubi is one half of ayahuasca. It is a plant that already has a long history of speaking to humans, and something that is very present and very prevalent in a lot of Brazilian culture. When you open jagubi, the different types of jagubi have different types of textures and structures inside of them. And when we were looking at where we might find language, where we might find ways of seeing what is most important to this plant, what this plant is expressing in all of its different iterations, we came to rest on these spaces and realized that each of these points is a whole glyph. It's one point of communication containing many small messages, messages about time and growth, about hydration, about competition, about alliances, all sorts of different things. And in the story of Tree Tongue, it's a future where therolinguists are in the Amazon working closely with the jagubi and its stewards and discover a recurring series of symbols inside of the tree. And when they break down these symbols, what they discover is a series of glyphs. And the glyphs translate into something that later gets called the Jagubi Declaration. Now, the Jagubi Declaration is designed to be read in the same way that a vascular plant grows, which is from the roots upwards. It's also articulated in stacks in the way that the plant grows, so that symbols are layered on top of each other and only made visible into a human framework as they are identifiable, I guess, through slicing the plant or traveling down through the plant. And this is what was found inside of the jagubi, a statement that says, all are whole, all are healed, all are healing. Offshoot in togetherness, pass the breath, share the seed, make alliance. Bud and blight are kin, reach, reaching. Life is motion, sing the cycle, the fall fertilizes. Come to rot, to rest, to repair, to rebirth. All form is fluid. We thicken, we bind, we yield, we respond, we record, we remember. Time is water. Wet the wound, weave the rupture. The future is a forest. And you can see on the right here the breakdown of the symbols. So if we come back here, these are the symbols that were identified inside of the jagubi. There are 14 initial symbols that make up this first series of glyphs. And the meaning of the symbols is based on the science of the plant and the way that it appears and where it is identifiable. And so the idea is that the therolinguists in this future found this message recurring over and over and over, which is why it was able to be translated in the way that it was. And then that was circulated and celebrated as an identifiable and easily relatable evidence of plant intelligence. And the idea is that from that, the Jagubi Declaration and Protection Act was enshrined, which is, and I might have got carried away here, I did in fact write many thousands of words of a Environmental Protection Act, which I don't recommend as an artistic practice, but it has now happened. And so there is a document that goes with this work. And I should say that the work itself is an installation space, which invites people into the lab of Tree Tongue into the ongoing Therolinguistics translation efforts for the Jigubi, and features the declaration itself in a range of different ways. The many-page Jigubi Declaration and Protection Act, a breakdown of the language, and an invitation to participate by trying to use the language of the Jigubi to work outside of human parameters for language. And the way that we've invited people to do that is using these stamps, which have the glyphs inside them, and that's the Jigubi in the top of the stamp there. And the idea is that people layer these glyphs on top of each other using these meanings in order to create new frameworks. And one of the things inside of this space is this large introductory and explanatory poster. Breaks down the language and breaks down the logic, which is what I'd like to talk to you about next. So when we were translating, exploring, dreaming into feeling our way through the idea of a Jigubi language and a tree language, there were a range of things that we had to confront, which is the failures of translation across species lines. There are assumptions that we make about the way that language works and how certain things have meaning. It comes up in Author of the Acacia Seeds really beautifully, where they speak about ants only speaking in plural, or the fact that there are no words for alone in ant. And one of the things that came up particularly was this idea that the language would obviously work from the ground up. That would obviously be how you would be reading Tree Tongue, because that is the way that trees understand growth. But that also all of these things affect meaning. Compaction, dispersal, looping or ruptured things that are sealed, things that are leaking, things that are asymmetric, and things that are constantly in process. And we realized that we had to create a framework for a language that didn't necessarily have a start and stop, although we've presented it as a declaration. In the worlding, if you read the long document, it speaks about this being a language that is perpetually looping, that has no start and has no end, which is contained inside of the declaration itself, the idea that life is motion, the fall fertilizers, that for a tree there is no beginning and end. There are just different frames and forms. And that we thought about this idea of what a forest is to a tree, how energy passes around and what that would mean for the language, how things would modify forms for one another, how the application of different glyphs would create new types of forms that shift conditions and meanings. And that kin, as particularly if we use it in environmental humanities or more than human framework, might not mean the same thing in a plant frame. And there are all these beautiful things about trees, and we really did begin in this place, an idea of reciprocity, an idea of perpetual cycle, of regeneration, of transformation, of the giving of breath, of life. And here I've included a little excerpt from Robert Macfarlane's Song of the Cedars to emphasize that sort of perception, the romantic perception, I suppose, of trees. Birds, sing me your rhymes, please, and stones, teach me your times. But one of the things that we quickly ran into was that our understanding of plants is not what plant scientists will tell us about plants. It's not romantic and beautiful and soft and gentle. It's not all reciprocity and regeneration. Plants are, in fact, strategic. They are aggressive. They are manipulative. They spend time considering how they can alter their material form as a way to control animal behavior, which they do in a lot of places. And I highly recommend going and finding, I can put things in the links, but anything where plant scientists are speaking about wheat or coffee and the ways in which mass human behavior has been modified by plants intentionally. Very, very interesting. And this is just a quote from Ursula Le Guin to highlight that point where the translation fails. So this phrase, in talking to some friends the other day, I'm currently co-editing the Posthuman Press's new volume, which is about therolinguistics, and we talked about this. And my friends were interrogating me, where is the aggressive and strategic language? And I said, well, that's the failure of the translation, is that it's hidden there and you can't see it. We might think the future is a forest and think, oh, what a beautiful phrase. But is that what that means in a plant framework? Is a forest designed to be consuming and changing, to be taking light, to be withholding nutrients? It's a complex economy. And as is the phrase, make alliance. I don't know if in a plant framework, make alliance sounds the way that it does in a human framework, the idea of making kin, making family, sharing things with one another. And I just wanted to finish everything with this little quote from Val Farmer, which I won't read out, but if you would like to screenshot it, you're welcome to, who's was a wonderful Australian philosopher who had a lot to do with the early environmental humanities movement. And I love to come back to her work because her work is so much about reimagining, about challenging our assumptions and pushing into uncomfortable places. And it speaks so much to the experience I've had with Tree Tongue, because I have to tell you, as author Sue Burke would say, who wrote a beautiful book called Semiosis, and she says, I don't want you to be afraid of plants, but I don't want you to not be afraid of plants. And I think that's a really great place to end. Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you so much, Dax. That was really awesome. And thank you to both of you for sharing such rich work. I just love how both of your practices engage so strongly with, of course, ideas of non-human forms of voice and intelligence and agency as inspiration for your practice, but also, as I was attempting to say in the beginning, you're both trying to build positive futures for humans and for other species at the same time. Um, I'd love to give it over to our audience now for a chance to chime in. If anyone has any questions for our speakers, feel free to chime in or to drop them in the chat. We do have a question here in the chat from Sabine. Hi, Sabine. Um, says, thank you so much to both of you. When it comes to interspecies translation, are there specific concrete strategies you both employ to avoid projecting human narratives and desires onto the non-human voices? So specific concrete strategies.
It's a tough question. I mean, for myself, I can't get out of my human form, right? This is my material form, and then my brain is a human brain. And so I'm going to be projecting my human narrative there, right? Because I'm a human. So I'm always kind of aware of what the limitations of my own form is. I mean, I suppose for myself, I try to find other ways of communicating, for example, with plants through signals, through their natural biorhythms, outside of our, human ways of communicating, which is often, for example, our verbal language or whatever. So I feel like with plants, it can be more, I suppose, gently tactile about presence, being sort of equal and mutual presence, operating in the same space. For example, if I have like a plant in my studio, so at the moment I have a bunch of anthuriums, which are in flower. And so if I have my sensors connected up to them and I can hear them signaling, what I often find is if I walk out of the room, they'll go quiet. And if I walk back to the room and approach them, they'll start signaling again. And that's because they're aware of my presence. Right, and so they're aware of my presence because of the sonic vibrations, probably that I'm making with my feet, and maybe I'm talking a bit when I'm around them, maybe I'm creating sound around them, but they're very aware that I am entering and exiting the room. So I suppose that's sort of that idea, I guess, of trying to tune in to how other species are communicating and, their own forms of language and writing, whatever that might be. But yeah, it's impossible to not project your human narrative, right? Because you're human. So what do you reckon, Dax?
Yeah, I feel like it's so funny, isn't it, working in these spaces? I feel like things are experimental and embodied and soft. I feel like there are no strong, clear frameworks because that isn't necessarily how humans would have traditionally and historically worked with other species. These are spaces of, I would say, pace and curiosity, which are probably not great answers for a method, but are very much the methods that I use. And return, right? It's particularly in the time that we're living in, to ask someone to attend to the life cycles and perspectives and desires of a tree requires an enormous temporal shift, big imaginative work. And I think the best thing you can do is, as Rewa said, be present, spend time with, and as much embodied time as you can. I think things like ayahuasca are such an interesting, and there are myriad examples, but an interesting example because in order to get ayahuasca, you have to mix two different plants together. You have to prepare and mix two different plants. And at some point, that instruction was gleaned by a human who then went and did it. And there are examples of that all around the world in all different spaces. It probably took a long time for someone to realize how to prepare an olive. It had to be soaked over, numerous days and the water rinsed over and over and over. There was a point where people were taking instruction from plants through dreams and through imagination and through visioning processes. And I think we have to leave the space to allow those things to be a part of our work, which is obviously an enormous challenge when we're also working inside of institutional spaces. But it is as valid, I think. And these are some of the ways that others are speaking. And there might be, fantastic hard science ways to break that down in the future. We might discover it's about what you breathe from a plant that affects the way you think about it. Entirely possible, but this is a vast network of mysteries that we live inside of, and I think the best way to move outside of the human frameworks is just to be deeply, deeply curious about the way that others function and observing what it is that they do and don't seem to want, and who they do and don't seem to work with, and what their processes are, and just being uncomfortable with being a human, trying to do more than human work.
Astrid, I can see you have a hand raised.
Yeah, hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for these wonderful talks. I'm totally stunned. I have this very little segment of memory from seeing the MIDI sprout in action. Like that was like, I don't know, must have been 6, 7 years ago, and I was completely taken away. Anyway, I have a question because a lot of things are going on in my mind as a sociolinguist. I'm really interested in the semiotics of it all, and I mean, how much of it is actually linguistics? And I mean, I could clearly see a syntax in some of these depictions that you showed us, Dax. But yeah, how much of it is actually language, and how much of it is some other form of I don't know, signaling, I guess. That's the one question I have, and the other one is kind of maybe related. How we can study human interference, or other species interference, and how it changes the patterns of plant communication from these syntactic segments that you showed us. Is this something you've done already, or would it require a large longitudinal study over years and years? Yeah, I'm just really amazed by all this. Thanks.
I think it's probably longitudinal study, but it is, there is so much work already in the space of plant communication and human presence or disruption. There's some really exciting research going on in Australia, particularly around, I think, the University of Adelaide. And I can find people's names if people are interested in tracking those down. This iteration of Tree Tongue is just a small beginning of a development. It's intended to be a much larger form project. So it does adhere to a structure, like a linguistic structure. I have the benefit of, because I did the Masters in Therolinguistics, and I am involved in a peer group who do Therolinguistics. We do tend to talk quite a lot about this, and there's an enormous spectrum of what gets developed in that space, from experimental, playful stuff right the way down to really linguistic structures and frameworks. And I would say that this is a very soft entry into that. We wanted to leave a lot of space because the next stage of this project, the things that people are using the stamps for to make new glyphs, the thing that they're invited to write on is a proposition for a new word or a message to be taken to the Jagubi. And the next stage of this project is for us to take it to the stewards in the Amazon that we've been working with, and to deliver these messages to the Amazon. And the intention is to then develop the next stage of the language directly with the stewards on site. So at the moment, we have been working with a couple of different Indigenous consultants or participants whose voice is present in the project in a couple of different ways. But there needs to be more before we are really locking things down in the speculative space. And I'll let Rewa speak to the next bit.
Thank you.
Oh, yes, it really, I just find linguistics is super interesting, especially sociolinguistics, because all, different cultures, as you know, have really different ways of relating to what we consider nature through language, right? But we are nature as well. We are part of the animal kingdom. And so, yeah, it's interesting. So the a culture that I am from, so I'm a quarter New Zealand Māori from the Ngāhui and Te Uriohau tribe in Hapu, which is in the far north of Aotearoa, New Zealand, in the region called Te Tai Tokoro. And so we have a really famous tree called Tane Mahuta, which is a big tourist attraction, but we consider Tane Mahuta is also the god of the forest. So way back in cosmology, so Māori have like a pantheon of gods, like as you know, there's Greek gods like, Zeus and
Yeah.
Hera and all of those guys and girls. So we have our own pantheon of gods. So Tani Mahuta is the god of the forest. And so there's this giant Kauri tree. And you guys probably know the Queensland Kauri tree, if you're coming from Australia. So there's a giant Kauri tree, which is called Tani Mahuta, been, alive for 150 odd years. And so what we traditionally do is, in fact, a lot of other people do it now, tourists now do it because they watch us doing it, is we walk up to the tree and press our nose next to the bark and just kind of breathe in and out a few times, and that's the idea of the breath of life. It's called a tihe moriora, which is the breath of life, and I think it's this sort of recognition that we have like a physical connection, but also a spiritual connection with this tree as our ancestor. So it's officially an ancestor of my hapu te Uriohau, one of my hapu. But I just dropped a little whakatoki, which is a Māori proverb, in the chat, because Dax was talking about the whanganui, the iwi at whanganui atara. So they have a really famous whakatoki which goes back hundreds of years, right? Hundreds and hundreds of years, probably like 400, 500 years. And it says, ko o te awa, ko te awa ko o, which is, I am the river and the river is me. And so that's like a relationship through language, through human linguistics, where we're sketching out our relationship, but it's different for all the different tribes. And so the first actually instance of personhood in a geological form or in a non-human form in Aotearoa was actually this mountain range called Te Urewera, which is the Tuhui tribe in charge of this kind of area called Te Urewera. And so they, in 2014, they passed a special act in Parliament called the Te Urewera Act of 2014, which meant that this whole mountain range is actually considered the first thing, non-human thing in Aotearoa to be considered a person. And so that's what this Whanganui River decision is kind of based on. But that's only possible because there's a parallel system in New Zealand which relies on this amazing thing called the Treaty of Waitangi, which my fifth great-grandfather signed in 1840 and then later regretted. But anyway, it's a founding treaty document, which was signed between Britain and different Māori tribes. So there's been this kind of, I think, in all these different cultures, right, going back to the sociolinguistics of it, every culture, especially indigenous cultures, have ways of framing themselves within nature through language. And, you see with Inuit culture over here, they have, dozens of words for snow. Yep. And so it's in, a lot of indigenous cultures around the world. So, yeah, I think it's really important to try and understand this sort of indigenous link as something which ancient humans all had, right? Mm-hmm. It's just that in Western civilization, we've kind of lost it and forgotten it. And it's up to us now. And, the work that Dax is doing, I think, is just fantastic in this regard, because it's up to us now in 2026 to try and reclaim some of these ancient ways of being and knowing and bring them into the contemporary world.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Thank you.
Thanks for sharing all this.
Thank you. Do we have any more audience questions this morning? I know we've just gone 10, and so I know that time is running short, but if there are any other questions, I'm happy for there to be an extra 5 minutes if we need it. Cool. otherwise, thank you so much to everyone for coming today. And thank you also to our two speakers, of course, for sharing their incredible works and insights. Yeah, thank you to you both for making Monday night in Australia and Monday morning here so much more interesting and entertaining than it might normally be. Um, so yeah, thank you for fitting into our time zone from all the way across the world. It's been really, really great. Um, just before we go, um, I would like to just make a really quick plug for the next talk in our Laser Bergen series. We have one taking place on March 26th, which is a Thursday. It's 10 a.m. Our time here in Europe. We're looking at microclimate research and how artists and scientists are working together to add a creative lens to how microclimate research is being performed here in Norway with the Norwegian Institute of Nature Research. That talk will be hosted by Jason Nelson. So I hope to see you there. Thank you so much. And thank you to Dax and Rewa. Any final words?
Just thank you, Alinta, for bringing everyone together this way. And Jason, I mean, it's just fabulous. And, and Dax, I hope to kind of get to carry on these conversations with you all in the future. I think there's
Let's continue the conversation.
a lot we can talk about. Yeah. So, yeah, awesome. Thank you, everyone. And yeah, best Monday night in a while.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much. It's been really fantastic to share space and time with you all. Thanks for listening. Thanks for the good questions as well.
Thank you. Brilliant. Oh yeah, now everyone can see Jason's hair.